In this set of slides, we're going to talk about theoretical approaches to studying attitude change. And I'm going to give you two very different kinds of theories. One theory I think you'll find to be intuitively appealing and it makes sense, but it has not been a very useful theory for helping us to really understand attitude change and attitude formation. The other theory, on the other hand, has been probably one of the most influential theories in social psychology. So this is not just to tell you about different theories of attitude change, but it's also a way of getting you to appreciate why some theories are more useful than others. The thing that makes a theory useful is if it lends itself to creating hypotheses that can be experimentally tested. Now, it may turn out that the theory was incorrect. It did not make the kinds of predictions that we hoped it would, but it can still be a very useful theory if it helps us move knowledge along. A theory that isn't so useful, however, may even be true to some extent, but if it just doesn't help you generate hypotheses and learn new things, it's not very useful. So let me talk about the functional approach to attitude change as an example of a theory that has been around for a while and you often see it discussed in textbooks, but it just hasn't really led us very far in understanding attitude change. According to the functional approach to attitude change, the reason we have attitudes is because they perform some function for us. They work for us in some way. And the way to get a person to change that attitude is to manipulate things so that the attitude no longer works. It no longer satisfies the function that it's designed for. Now, attitudes can have a variety of different functions according to this perspective. Some attitudes may have a utilitarian or instrumental function. We have the attitude because it's a means to an end. So maybe I work for a company that I truly believe to be the best company of its kind, far superior to its competitors, that it makes good products, that it's environmentally responsible, and all of the other things you might hope for in a company. Well, this can be a very useful attitude to have because if I'm enthusiastic about the place that I work and it makes me work hard and people notice how much I care, maybe I get promoted and maybe I do well in the company. And so I may have that attitude because it works for me. It allows me to accomplish something. Other attitudes we might have because they serve a value expressive function. Most of us find it very rewarding to be able to communicate to others who we are and what we care about and let people know what we're all about. And certain attitudes help us express those kinds of values. So maybe you're an environmental activist and you care very much about the planet and sustainability. And that's such a core part of who you are that expressing and holding those attitudes also allows the world to know something about you and your values. Ego defensive functions of attitudes serve to protect us from threat. So maybe there's a group of people that I treat badly. I don't pay much attention to them and I'm kind of rude to them when I have to interact with them. But I think of myself as a good person. I think of myself as a decent individual. Well, if I adopt a negative attitude about these people, they deserve to be treated this way, then I can maintain the positive image I have of myself. So having this negative attitude about a group of people protects me from the threat of thinking about myself in negative ways. Some attitudes provide what we call a knowledge function. They help you understand the world and to make sense of how things work. So maybe you're a religious person who believes in an afterlife where people are rewarded or punished for the things that they did during their lives. Well, having this kind of attitude may help you deal with the apparent unfairness of the world when innocent people seem to suffer while bad people are getting ahead and being financially successful. Thinking that everybody's going to get what they have coming to them in the afterlife is a way to help you make sense of what's going on now. So the gist of it is figure out what function the attitude is serving for an individual, manipulates things so the attitude doesn't work for them very much anymore, and you should be able to change the attitude. The problem with this theory has been that it just hasn't generated very much research compared to other theories. It's hard to tell for sure why a person holds a certain attitude, or whether the attitude is being held for a variety of different functions at the same time. It's just hard to define these things, hard to come up with hypotheses that are testable, and so the theory hasn't been very useful. Next, I'm going to talk about a theory that has been hugely influential. Cognitive dissonance theory is one of the most influential theories, not just in social psychology, but in all of psychology. It was proposed by Leon Festinger in 1957, and the short version here is that cognitive dissonance is something that we feel. It's a feeling of discomfort that we get when we perceive that a couple of our attitudes are in competition or in disagreement with each other. They're incompatible. Or if we perceive that our behavior and our attitudes are out of sync, that we're behaving in a way that contradicts our attitudes. Any of those situations will produce cognitive dissonance. And according to Festinger, cognitive dissonance is an actual physiological arousal. It's an unpleasant sensation that motivates us to do something to get rid of it. For example, when you are hungry, you have this uncomfortable, unpleasant feeling, which we call hunger, and that motivates you to get something to eat to get rid of the hungry feeling. Or when you're thirsty, it motivates you to get something to drink to get rid of the thirsty feeling. Well, cognitive dissonance is the same way. We get this unpleasant, dissonant feeling that motivates us to change something or do something to get rid of that unpleasant feeling. And there is, in fact, evidence that putting someone in a situation where they experience cognitive dissonance does, in fact, increase their arousal levels. Now, Festinger's theory has been extremely influential, but it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. There were other things going on in psychology at the time that Festinger sort of based his theory on. In the 1950s, it was very popular for social psychologists to use something called balance theory to frame the theoretical questions they were asking. And it was being used in all kinds of areas of psychology, not just in the study of attitudes, but in the study of relationships, in the study of group behavior, in the study of decision making, and so on. But here's the way to think about balance theory. Let's suppose you have three people who know each other, Betty, Sue, and Joan. If there's a plus or a minus in between the two names, the plus means these are two people who like each other. A minus would mean they're two people who don't like each other. And if you have this little system of three people, the system can be balanced or unbalanced depending upon the nature of the relationships. So if there are pluses all the way around, Betty likes Sue a lot and Sue likes Betty a lot, Betty likes Joan a lot, and Joan and Sue like each other, that system is in balance because there's no tension there. Everybody's on the same page, everybody likes each other, so there's no pressure to change anything. If all of these signs were negatives, that would also be balanced. If Betty didn't like Sue or Joan, and Sue or Joan didn't like each other, once again, there's no problem because there's no pressure to change anything. Everybody's happy, nobody likes each other, and they don't have to hang out together. Now, if you have a situation where Betty is attracted to Sue and Joan, but there's a negative relationship between Sue and Joan, that creates a problem because now the three of them together will have issues. Betty really likes hanging out with Sue and Joan, but they don't like being with each other. So this creates tension and it creates a pressure to change something. to bring the system back into balance. So it would be considered to be unbalanced in that example. So maybe Sue and Joan mend their fences and decide they like each other. That would bring the system back into balance. Or maybe Betty develops a negative attitude towards one of the other two, and there's just a positive relationship between her and Joan. She no longer likes Sue. Well, now the fact that Sue and Joan don't get along doesn't create a problem anymore, so the system is balanced again. So basically, a lack of balance in the system creates pressure to change something. Here's another example of a balanced versus unbalanced system. Let's suppose Pam likes Oliver a lot and she's crazy about skiing, but Oliver hates skiing. Well, this creates some tension, right? There's a lack of balance there. On the right-hand side, however, if Pam doesn't like Oliver and Oliver doesn't like skiing and Pam is crazy about skiing, now this is balanced because she doesn't care if Oliver likes skiing or not because she doesn't like him. And so there won't be a situation where she is trying to get him to do something he doesn't want to do. But a lack of balance, something that's unbalanced, creates pressure to change. And prior to Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, this had also been applied to the understanding of attitude and attitude change. So if you've got a person and an object and a behavior, they can be in balance with each other or out of balance, and a lack of balance prompts you to try to change something. What Festinger did, though, was to add in the concept of an actual state of physiological arousal that he called cognitive dissonance as the motivating drive in these situations. And he talked in a much more sophisticated way about the relationship between behavior and attitudes. So according to Festinger, human beings dislike inconsistency between their attitudes and their behavior, and they also like inconsistency among their different attitudes, and this inconsistency motivates them to change something to get rid of the inconsistency. So let's suppose in this example here, you've got a belief that the person has connected with a behavior, but the behavior isn't what the person should be doing based on the belief that they have. This will create dissonance. And there are different ways to reduce dissonance. You can change the belief, or you can stop the behavior, or you can change your perception of the relationship between the behavior and the belief, and that will reduce dissonance. Let's do a more concrete example. Let's suppose we have a situation where a person is a smoker, but they also believe that smoking is unhealthy and that it creates serious health problems like heart disease and lung cancer. And presumably the person doesn't want to get lung cancer. And so if you think of this as a triangle, there's a positive relationship between the individual and smoking, a negative relationship between the individual and lung cancer because they don't want to get it. But then this positive connection between smoking and lung cancer creates a lack of balance. There's an inconsistency. So if I don't want to get lung cancer, why am I smoking? Well, there are several different ways you can resolve this. In my class, I usually ask some smokers to self-identify and ask them how they deal with the dissonant situations. Now, frequently they simply say they don't think about it much, and that's a good way to deal with it. It's only dissonant if you are aware of it, and so keeping it in your unconscious is a way of keeping it at arm's length. But sometimes people report that they try to stop smoking. So if you no longer smoke, then the dissonance goes away. Or you decide that you don't believe the link between smoking and lung cancer. You know somebody that was 95 years old and they smoked 5 packs a day and they were healthy. And so you convince yourself there is no real link between smoking and lung cancer. Or Sometimes people do the perverse thing of saying, well, I love to smoke, um, but I'm going to build something else into this system. It's only going to cause lung cancer if I smoke for a long time, and I'm not going to do that. Or I'm going to have to die of something. This gives me some control over what that thing is. Whatever it is, there are all ways of getting rid of this uncomfortable situation where you have to have to change something, and usually you change in the direction of that's easiest. And often the easiest thing to change is your attitude. Sometimes it's a lot easier to change an attitude than it is to change a behavior. Another key aspect of cognitive dissonance is that in order to feel dissonance, you have to feel as if you have freely chosen the behavior that you're engaging in or to hold the attitude that you're holding. If you perceive that you have no choice, if you have no opportunity to behave otherwise, then dissonance doesn't occur. Social psychologists have studied classical dissonance in a number of standard situations in the laboratory. And let me tell you about some of those studies. The first one is called post-decisional dissonance. Whenever you're making a decision between two equally attractive alternatives, what you'll experience when you make the choice immediately, right after you've made the choice, is a certain discomfort. By picking the one alternative, you suddenly become aware of the downsides of the thing that you've chosen and also aware of the upsides of the thing that you've rejected. And this creates dissonance that you need to resolve. And usually you resolve that by enhancing or pumping up your evaluation of the thing that you've chosen and playing down the thing that you have rejected as something you didn't really want. You've probably all had this experience yourself. If you go into a store to make a choice between two items of clothing or some other product that you're buying, you pick one rather than the other, and as you're walking to the register, you're struggling with your choice, and maybe you even go back and put the thing back and pick the other one. That's all reflecting the fact that you're dealing with post-decisional dissonance. And there have been a number of studies that show that people do, in fact, change their attitudes about things as a result of this post-decisional dissonance. In one early classic study, college women were asked to choose between two items, and they were given a choice between two items that were very close to each other in terms of how much the woman wanted them, or that they were very different from each other. And what they found was when women had to choose between two equally attractive things, later on when they were asked to evaluate again how attractive they thought they increased how much they liked the thing they chose and decreased how much they liked the thing that they hadn't chosen. And then other items that they had previously evaluated didn't change in value because there was no dissonance motivating any reason to change the way you felt about those. Similarly, when you approach people at a racetrack who are standing in line waiting to bet on a horse and ask them how confident they are that the horse is going to win, you find that they're often not very confident because it's not too late for them to change their mind. They're still struggling with the decision. But if you go and approach them sometime after they've placed the bet and ask them how confident they are now, you find that they're much more confident that their horse is going to win than they were before because they have resolved the dissonance they were struggling with previously. Another situation in which people experience dissonance is in a situation where you firmly believe that something is going to happen and then it doesn't. And the disconnect between your expectations and what actually occurs can be quite unsettling. One of the classic studies in this area was a situation where people had to go through sort of a very embarrassing ordeal to become a member of a discussion group on a campus. And then they found out that the discussion group was really lame and boring. And they were compared to a control group of people who were allowed to join this group without going through the embarrassing ordeal. And you found that the people who went through the ordeal in order to join actually ended up liking the group better because they had to, in some way or other, resolve this dissonance that they had. This is the psychology behind things like hazing, for example. If you go through hell to become a member of a group, it can be kind of disconcerting to get into this group and find that everybody's kind of a jerk. And so you tend to enhance your perceptions of what the group is like after you're in there to justify what it is that you just went through. Getting people to behave in what we call attitude discrepant ways or engaging in counter-attitudinal behavior is also a way of producing cognitive dissonance. The classic study in this area was done by Festinger and Carlsmith in 1959. People were paid either $1 or $20 to go and lie to another subject in an experiment about how interesting the experiment was. They had engaged in this god-awful, boring task, very repetitive. It went on forever. And then they were asked to sort of sell it to another subject that it was really kind of interesting. Well, the people who were paid only $1 actually changed their attitudes about how boring the thing was, because to see themselves lying about something for only $1 created an awful lot of dissonance. The people who were paid $20, on the other hand, didn't change their perceptions of the task at all because they knew why they were doing it. They were doing it for the money, and therefore there was no dissonance for them to resolve. They didn't really have to explain their behavior to themselves. And so this has been shown in a lot of other interesting ways. One of my favorite studies was done with ROTC military cadets. These were college students who were training to be in the military after they graduated. And they volunteered for an experiment on wilderness survival techniques. And one of the things they had to do in this experiment was to eat grasshoppers. Now, the experimenter in the study was a military officer. And in one condition, the officer was very friendly, very relaxed, very casual. In the other condition, he was very cold and formal, kind of aggressive and unpleasant. And in either case, they were asked to eat these grasshoppers by the experimenter. Now, it was emphasized to these cadets that they were free to leave the experiment anytime they want, that they were completely there on their own as volunteers. And this was important to give them this illusion that they were engaging in freedom of choice. And then later on, they were asked to evaluate the eating of the grasshoppers. How pleasant did they think it was? And the people who ate the grasshoppers for the cold, nasty experimenter actually reported liking them better. The people who ate them for the other experimenter were able to justify their behavior by saying, well, he seemed like a nice guy, I wanted to help him out in his experiment. But they couldn't explain their behavior to themselves that way in the other situations. So one of the things you can do to resolve the dissonance is change your perception of how bad it really was. One more example based on eating disgusting things. In another study, college students were led to believe that as part of an experiment, they would be eating a dead worm. It was emphasized to them that they were volunteers who could quit whenever they wanted. And this was done, of course, to convince them that they were acting of their own free will. So after they were given this negative expectation, they sat around for a while. But then one group was given a choice of eating the worm or participating in a different experiment instead, which was described as a simple perception experiment. Previous research had shown that if you gave people a choice between a perception experiment and an eating a worm experiment, everybody chooses the perception experiment. However, in this experiment, 3/4 of the subjects chose to eat the worm. They redid this experiment where they were given this expectation again, and then they were told, well, we have too many subjects in this experiment. You can either be in another experiment that's a simple perception experiment, or a third experiment that involves some painful electric shocks. And surprisingly, half of the people selected the electric shock experiment. Now, this seems like some seriously disordered behavior, but what was going on here was once people had convinced themselves that they were going to be eating this worm, they resolved their dissonance by, well, in a number of different ways. Maybe they convinced themselves that they were going to do something special that not just anybody could do, and that they were going to sort of be a martyr for the cause of science. And then when you were given you gave them the choice of, well, do you really want to do this? They had to say yes, because now if they bailed out, they would experience dissonance all over again. So you can get people to do some pretty strange things because of cognitive dissonance. There have been people who have tried to explain the results of cognitive dissonance studies in a different way. And the most popular of these has been self-perception theory, proposed by Daryl Bem. According to Bem, Festinger's Festinger's theory was unnecessarily complicated. Festinger proposed that there's this arousal that occurs, and that this is the thing that motivates behavior, and on and on and on. Bem said it's really much more straightforward than that. You basically observe your own behavior and then draw conclusions based on what you see about what your attitude must be. And so if you see yourself being willing to eat a dead worm, then you must not think eating a dead worm is so bad, and therefore you don't mind it. Or the problem with comparing self-perception theory to cognitive dissonance theory is they both make the same predictions, right? If I pay you a little bit of money to lie to somebody, whether you're resolving dissonance or just observing your own behavior, in either case, your attitude is going to be that you didn't mind being in the experiment that much. If I pay you a lot of money, your perception is going to be that you did it for the money. And so it's hard to come up with a classic experiment that would pit self-perception theory against cognitive dissonance theory. I won't get into all the details of how this controversy went on for about 30 years, but I will say that eventually they were able to pin down that self-perception and cognitive dissonance both seem to be operating, but they operate in slightly different ways. So both theories are still alive and well in social psychology, and both of them explain why we change our attitudes in certain situations.